Hi everyone, I'm Alec. I also go by Zero Age. I'm going to show you guys a couple of demos where we work through actually implementing the transaction permission layer, TPL. I prepared a demo you can play along with if you're interested, or you can check it out later. It's the TPL protocol repo and TPL contracts branch in the DevCon branch. So, first off, as a kind of high-level overview, TPL is a way to assign metadata to accounts, Ethereum accounts in particular, but it could pretty easily be adapted to other chains. And we're basically, our first use case for this is securities tokens. But it applies more broadly to any kind of permission token and even in non-token use cases. Our goal is to make it as efficient as possible. A lot of the existing solutions around identities or issuing claims, they require you to basically run EC recover and check every time you're verifying an attribute or a claim. And that can get expensive, especially if you're going to be building transfer restrictions right into the token. So that's our first thing. And two is to make it as broadly cross-compatible as possible. We're really trying to build out a base layer that lots of different projects can use and adapt to their own set of use cases. And we do this, at the core of it is this idea of a digital jurisdiction. And then each of those jurisdictions is the single source of truth within that jurisdiction. So every attribute that gets set on that jurisdiction per address is guaranteed to be unique. What we're going to do today, we're going to first just walk through setting up a jurisdiction and setting some attributes and what that process looks like in the abstract. Then we're going to deploy an ERC20 permission token called drink token, where you have to be 21 to hold the token. And then we're going to deploy a ERC721 that's permissioned called crypto copycats. So let's get started. So we kick off with install and a build, which we've already done. Okay, now let's deploy a jurisdiction. Oh. Well, let's start a local testnet, gas limit 8 million, and now we'll deploy our jurisdiction. Okay? So here we've got our contract address. And this jurisdiction is what we're going to use for all of our examples going forward. Now, one thing I'll mention really quickly is we have two different versions of jurisdictions right now. There's a basic jurisdiction, which is being used by Zeppelin in their new token, the Zeppelin OS platform token. And that is it's one where you have this idea of validators. Well, you have validators in both, but you have validators that issue and revoke attributes on behalf of all the participants. And they do that by calling directly into the jurisdiction. Now it's great for a lot of use cases, but we also see a future where validators might not want to be interacting with the chain directly. You might have validators that want to specialize in just verifying attributes, holding user data, keeping it private, all of that. And then they would issue off-chain signed attribute approvals that the actual participants or operators can relay and set themselves or include as part of data parameter in a transfer. So that's where the extended jurisdiction comes in. And this is there's obviously a lot more to it, but as we're going through, everything that we're going to be doing today will be supported by the basic jurisdiction. So we've got our jurisdiction deployed. Let's take a look at, here's some various methods. Can everyone see this all right?
This is better.
Great. All right. So here's a couple wrappers, just a command line interface that, admittedly, I put this together on the flight over here, and I'm a little wiped still, so give me a little slack. But basically, we've got a bunch of commands for running, setting attributes on jurisdiction. We got a couple for drink token, a couple for crypto copycats, and then as an example of a jurisdiction that's implemented as a smart contract, we have the crypto copycats cooperative that will basically regulate our market in crypto copycats. So let's start by walking through what adding an attribute looks like. So you have attribute types, which are broad categories of attributes. And those can have associated metadata about the type of attribute that's being issued. Then you have validators, which are issuers of these attributes. But the jurisdiction then assigns particular validators to particular attribute types. So you can specialize or have multiple validators that can issue one attribute type, and so on and so forth. So let's start by, you know what? I'm going to copy and paste in these commands here. So we'll add an attribute type with an ID 777 and a description, totally phenomenal lad or lass. All right? So it fires off an event, attribute type added, fills in the description, all of that. Not too complicated. All right, and now we'll add a validator. And for this command line interface, we just refer to whatever accounts are available by an index. So here's just the standard TPL validator. But at this point, this validator can't issue any attributes. So we'll add an approval. Bam. Fires off validator approval added. And now let's check. Obviously, we haven't set this yet. But let's look at one of the core methods in the TPL system. That's this has attribute. So really quickly, this gives back false. It hasn't been set yet. At the very, very base layer of TPL is this idea of an attribute registry, which makes 4 methods available, but there's 2 that are the important ones. And they're chosen to be as broadly compatible and simple as possible while still supporting a lot of use cases. And that's has attribute, guaranteed to give back true or false. So you can always check and see if an attribute exists. Then you also have get attribute value, which will give back a uint 256 associated with that attribute. Now you can use those to create nested objects by basically using keys that reference each level of nesting. So you'll notice here that this actually reverted. And that's because when you call get attribute value, if any time that has attribute would give back false, get attribute value is going to revert, it's going to throw. Anytime it gives back true, it's going to give you back some value, even if it's 0. And for many of the use cases today, we're actually just going to leave the attribute value set to 0. That's great for whitelists, for any kind of Boolean. So let's go ahead and issue the attribute. And the flag here at the end is, I'm issuing it from that first address, the validator address. Bam. Now we have an issued attribute. And if we now go back and check again, we get true, and when we get the attribute value, this time we get 0, since we didn't set it to anything initially. All right, so that's like really just basic, high level. what you're working with here. So now let's actually work through some examples of what a token might look like. So let's deploy our drink token. I'm going to pull up the code for drink token so you guys can take a look at what I mean. So here is a mock of drink token. We're going to pull in this TPL ERC20 restricted receiver. Now this is one of a number of examples that are in the repo for, and this is the one that's being utilized by Zeppelin right now, where you can't send a token to an address unless it has a valid attribute type that's defined when you kick off the token. Then it's also going to use this attribute registry interface that we've sort of been working with here. Declare a name, set out an event. Now in the constructor, we're just going to pass through a registry address that we're going to trust to hold and manage all these attributes on our behalf, and the attribute ID that we're looking for, which in this case is 11111. And then we've got this over 21 modifier. And this is saying, all right, do we have the attribute that we're looking for on the caller? And if so, proceed. If not, then throw this error message. You got to be 21 to use drink token. So now anyone that wants to can call ferment. And at that point, they'll get a token. And they can also call liquidate once they're at the bar at the event that's sponsoring drink token, which we have a couple of interested events that, and this is actually on the mainnet. It'll burn your token and they'll pour you your drink when the event gets fired, all right? But now let's look at this in action. So I want a drink token. I'm going to go ahead and call ferment. I got an error. I got to be verified first. So let's find out what drink token is looking for in terms of the attribute. It's looking for this 11111, like we mentioned earlier. So let's set an attribute type on the jurisdiction. There it is. Now we'll add a validator, an ID checker. We'll add an approval so that that ID checker can issue attributes of that type. And now we can issue the attribute that we're looking for. All right, now let's try and ferment a token. Great. Okay, I'm in business. Now, let's say I want to send this token to someone else. I'm going to run into this same error. One of the cool things about TPL is that it doesn't stop at the minting stage, the crowd sale stage. It's baked right in to every single transfer you're making. So if we issue an attribute now to the recipient, now we can transfer, and once they've received it, they get to the bar, they can liquidate the token and get their drink poured. So that's a basic example of how simple it really can be. I mean, this is less than 50 lines here. And if you want to just take a look really quickly, I want to show you a few other ERC20 examples while we're here. So we've also got a more broad sort of permissioned token, whereas the restricted receiver is just going to check if you can receive a token or not. This actually makes a few additional methods available, namely this can transfer, where you feed in whatever parameters you would feed into your transfer function, but it's an external view and will just spit back the success or not, and then critically, a status code of why the transfer would fail. Same thing for can transfer from. You can also find the registry. So it's pretty dead simple, but we can also take a look at the implementation here of what a restricted receiver token that we're inheriting from looks like. And from an implementation perspective, you're pushing as much of that off to the jurisdiction to manage those attributes, which really enables you to focus on the core logic of the token itself and not have to be tracking a bunch of balances. All right, and so for instance, here's what the transfer might look like. And let's look at the can transfer function, which is, oh, it's can receive for this one. All right, jumping back in, let's take a look at crypto copycats. So we'll deploy a crypto copycats. Let's quickly jump back out to ERC 721. This is implementing a ERC 721 permissioned token. And this is maybe a better example of what these can safe transfer from. Let's look at can transfer from, just because it's a little simpler. It's just going to step through all the potential reasons that this transfer might fail, check them, and then spit out according status codes. Now, this is actually an area of active discussion. I'm sure this week is going to be pretty instrumental in figuring out exactly what each of these status codes should look like. But I think that as long as the actual interface is dead simple and familiar, then it has a better chance of widespread adoption. All right, so let's continue on with our crypto copycats. Well, I'm actually going to show you the code here. Once again, once it inherits it from this ERC 721 permission, the code becomes very straightforward and simple. You just inherit the registry, the attribute you're looking for, and now we're just making two functions available externally. An adopt function, or anyone can adopt a CryptoKitty or a crypto copycat, assuming that they have been approved as a responsible pet owner. There's also now a rescue function. If it turns out that you're not a good pet lover, then that cat should find a better home, right? So let's go ahead and rescue the cat if those conditions are met. So we actually mint one of these crypto kitties, crypto copycats, by creating the contract. So here's our token ID. Let's see what this cat looks like. We have a nice cheap copycat knockoff here. And let's go drop in our DNA for the cat, the token ID, and start up a quote-unquote DApp. What? Well, this is a real shame. You're not going to get to see the knockoff cat right now. But I think we'll all live. Anyway, it's supposed to be a cat that's generated from the token ID. Maybe we'll revisit if we have time. But anyway, let's continue stepping through here. And tell you what. We're going to see the cat. Whatever. Okay. So first, let's try and transfer this token. And I bet you can guess what's going to happen when we transfer it. Returns an error, of course, because we haven't been approved. But let's look at, rather than adding and removing these, all of these attributes ourselves from an externally owned account, let's look at how we might do it from a deployed validator. So now we're going to deploy this crypto copycats validator contract right here. And now, let's look at that real quick and see what that code might look like. So this is an example of an implementation of a validator where we're going to inherit from this TPL basic validator that makes a bunch of methods available. Feed in our same sort of parameters, give it the registry we're going to be using, and the attribute that we're going to be working with. And there's no reason that this has to be hard-coded as well. I mean, this is just in the interest of simplicity. We make a modifier available so that you can only a designated care coordinator can actually revoke an attribute and say you're not a caring pet owner. But then we also make this issue attribute available where you have to answer some questions, some self-certifications as the case may be. And if you pass all the checks, then you're approved and you can actually take home a cat and adopt a cat. So let's walk through that really quickly. Remember, we've got to figure out what the attribute that we need is. This 22222 in this case. So let's add that attribute type to our jurisdiction here. Say you're a responsible pet owner. And now let's look at what we've got deployed. Here is the validator. So we're going to grab that address. Now we're going to add this particular address as a validator. Validator contract, there's our event. Now we can add that validator to the list of approved validators on the attribute type. Just like so. Now, all we got to do is call in and answer these questions. Do you love cats? Okay, yes, you can own a cat. Do you love dogs more than cats? Liars aren't allowed to own a cat, so yes, you do. And are you a crazy cat lady? No. Okay, so we issued ourselves the attribute we need. Now, if we also issue the attribute to the person we want to send it to, have them get one, this first address, Now we can transfer our token, which, let's grab that. All right, now the transfer works. Then let's say that turns out we realized that the person we sent the token to, the new owner of the crypto copycat, is actually a negligent owner. So we go talk to one of these care coordinators, and they end up revoking the attribute. Okay, in that case now we can rescue this cat as long as we have the attribute that we need. Let's go ahead and rescue it. Okay. Now, like I mentioned, all of these contracts and all of the code is available on the mainnet. If you go to, there's an extended jurisdiction that we're going to be using throughout DevCon. And if any of you would like to play around with it from the perspective of a validator or a participant or you name it, feel free to let myself or Connor know, and we'll get you set up. But it's at this devcon4.tplprotocol.eth. Drink token is at the subdomain drink token on that same ENS address. Same with crypto copycats, and the validator example is at CCC, which of course all regulatory bodies have to have a 3-letter acronym. So check it out, play around with it, and I guess I'll open the floor to any questions you might have. I'd love to dig into the internals of, this has been more of just a top level, but I'd love to answer more specific questions about some of the intricacies of how it would work for a more complex system.
So the question, which I didn't get from your talk, when you're validating, let's say, the sender of a token, and you bake in some methods in order to detect that. But let's say in a future scenario, you need to adopt that to the recipient. Like, would you dynamically be able to adapt to that scenario, or do you need to deploy a new smart contract?
So the first TPL jurisdiction and contract that relies on it are both upgradable proxies, transparent proxies, which of course you can pretty much always upgrade an upgradable proxy like that as long as you're careful. It introduces a lot of complexity. Ideally, you have a more graceful upgrade mechanism in place where it's easy enough to point to, let's say that I wanted to, I thought maybe there's a scenario where I'd like to permit all recipients at this stage and all senders at this stage, and then I maybe just want to permit the recipients, and then I want to restrict them all, whatever it is. The preferred method in my mind for doing this is to utilize one of the core features of TPL that I really like, and that is to utilize secondary sources. Basically, a jurisdiction can look at another jurisdiction and say, all right, when it comes to this attribute, I'm going to just trust them, especially if it hasn't already been set on my own jurisdiction. And that way you can have separation of concerns, but what you can also do is it gives you an upgrade path where if you can point to new jurisdictions, right? If you have a method where some controller of the contract or a governance platform can actually look to a new jurisdiction, they can deploy their own, point that to the old one, and point the contract to the new one. And then, for instance, you could have the attributes on that registry always return true or always return false. And then all of those checks would go through, or all of them wouldn't. And so that gives you a sort of graceful upgrade path that doesn't involve swapping out the entire contract, because as a user, if you know that the logic can change at any time, then you're not going to have the same assurances. Whereas, especially when it just comes to permissions as you go, there's a more flexible architecture there that's available. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I think I was looking at the terms and conditions of Circle's USDC, on new USD egg. There's a token. And they have some similar mechanisms to what can be achieved with.
Oh, the terms of drink token here.
No, so I'm just mean like how this would work out in practice for complex users. So essentially, it's a stable token, right? And it's an ERC20 token that has capabilities of blacklisting and freezing the transactions and also individual accounts. So this is things that they need to have in order to be compliant with regulations, right? And they also, of course, do full KYC and AML, which is in practice carried out by third parties, which they change private data with. And what we get in my view on that is that it ends up being like the worst of both worlds, of the decentralized versus the old centralized ways, because you still can't roll back transactions. So like if you make a mistake or you get defrauded, you have no course of actions, but you still have the intermediary there that you have to kind of, you're at their mercy.
I felt the same way reading through their code. It stops short of having a full-blown transfer agent that can arbitrarily move your tokens around, but they can still freeze your tokens.
And with, regardless of how it's implemented in practice, I think we might end up in similar scenarios here where the users kind of lose out in the end. And it's only because that the institutions that provide the services are forced to do this because of both the limitations of blockchain or the constraints of blockchain plus the regulatory pressure. So what's your takes on that? How do we make it into a good outcome?
So I think that we are in a very precarious position right now, where there's obviously a lot of big name projects that want to do everything by the book, follow all the rules, and I think that what blockchain does more than anything is it gives you agency to not only create whatever kind of system you want to create, as restrictive or permissive as you like, but also to choose those systems that work. And yes, there are network effects inherent in, if a big name comes out and issues a stable token, they kind of get to set the rules if that is the one that's the medium of exchange all of a sudden. What we are trying to do at TPL is establish a really broadly compatible base layer. If this is the direction that a lot of projects are going to go, you can't stop anyone from deploying code to the blockchain. And so this is the direction they're moving. We would like to really make sure that we establish an architecture that it promotes decentralization by broad cross-compatibility and ease of migrations between different jurisdictions and composability between them. So if any one gets out of hand, then it's easy enough to basically move, so to speak. It's very difficult to move if you live somewhere and you're rooted there, but it's very cheap and easy to move if it's just changing a pointer in your token.
But in practice, this will most likely be tied to where you physically reside.
I think one of the main initial applications of a jurisdiction will be a physical jurisdiction that's mapped pretty tightly. But once you have that physical jurisdiction, I think a lot of projects will want a global audience and may actually call into a whole number of jurisdictions that map onto physical, as well as other jurisdictions. what I'm really excited about are the jurisdictions that can push the limits of what it really means to be in a jurisdiction and to be a digital agent and have self-sovereignty in that sense, while also supporting the use cases where, for instance, dealing with negative reputation and issues of when you can just burn a totally self-sovereign identity, then it promotes bad actors in the space. And I think that part of this industry maturing has really been finding ways to combat the really dark underbelly of it, and it's come a long way already. But that's really my opinion, and I'm excited to see if we can move the needle on the forces that are at play around compliance and regulations, where I know that anyone that launches a token does not want to go to jail. And it would be great if you could launch a token and not have to move to the Cayman Islands to do it. And that you could transact in a token without having to worry that you're on the outside of the law. So I think there is a real demand. It's just finding ways to protect from centralization in general, and to vote with your feet and choose projects like DAI, for instance, if you want a stablecoin that is that's all about that rather than the alternatives.
Yeah, also I think like when we talk about centralization, decentralization, it's important to clarify like what kind of centralization. Like, are we talking about like infrastructure level or control over parts of the system? It's
yeah, and that actually brings up another point. The TPL architecture doesn't make any recommendations on governance. Governance is left entirely up to you. It can be as simple as you control a jurisdiction yourself. You control it from a DAO or a smart contract. You control it from a multi-sig of interested parties. But what it boils down to is that that's sort of left up to the implementer, and it's meant to be as flexible as possible and not tell you how you have to run the jurisdiction. And that's another area I'm really excited to see people coming up with broadly cross-compatible governance platforms where they can talk to one another and work together in deploying jurisdictions and other areas of governance.
And it's also really great that you're really lowering the barrier of entry for people who want to be compliant, because there's already a toolbox for it in form of this.
The goal is to make it as easy to reason about while still being feature rich and being able to meet those compliance guidelines. And also, beyond just the mental overhead being brought down and the development effort being brought down, it's also an effort to bring the actual gas costs down of all of these operations. Anytime that you're verifying signatures, when you're checking for attributes or claims or what have you, all of a sudden you're more than doubling the cost of a transaction. And if you have a token that's being used by thousands of people every day, that's just dead weight loss and going to hamper adoption and clog the chain and all that. So our rationale is let's allow that complexity to move into the management and the setting and the revoking of attributes, and then make the actual querying for them both cheap and dead simple. Basically the idea. And yeah, any other questions? Go on.
The concept of validators. So I would be interested, what are your plans for maybe extending this concept of validators, or which direction we will go in the next month?
Like what entities would be validators, or what what controls you have?
A very interesting concept, but I would like to know what are your plans in the future. Do you plan to make it more sophisticated, or leave it to the developers?
So let's look really quickly. Let's look at there we go. Let's look at the interface for the extended validator, just so you can get an idea of where we're going. And This is stuff that has not been as thoroughly vetted and audited, but, oh, I'm in the wrong. Let's just look at the interface for the extended jurisdiction. So these are additional methods that are available beyond just your standard stuff. So the first thing you notice is validator signing keys. A validator can set a signing key that's associated with their account and then manage everything related to changing their top level information from cold storage lockdown keys, but then can have signing key that's distributed throughout their organization or whatever. The next thing is stake. And the idea behind stake is that you can, a validator, or optionally a jurisdiction, but we'll focus on a validator here. Every time that a validator issues an attribute, they can require that the person that submits that off-chain attribute approval includes some amount of ether with the attribute assignment. And that gets locked into the contract. Then, if they discover that that attribute is no longer valid, they don't have to go through and pay for all of those revocations. They can actually get a transaction rebate paid back to them. So it's a wash for them, but then the refund gets sent back to the actual person assigning it. It also could be used as a method for Sybil resistance or a sort of barrier to entry for assigning attributes where you don't want to necessarily go through such a vigorous process. Same thing for fees. And all of this is in the vein that we want to make all of this as straightforward and easy to reason about as possible, and leave the power to make those decisions in the hands of the people running jurisdictions. And remember, it's a public blockchain. It's free to check attributes. Even if you tried to build in a system where you had to pay to check for attributes every time, it would be difficult. The one area that I think that's actually feasible to do would be a validator that would only issue one-time use, very short expiration approvals that would get submitted along with transfers for tokens or something like that, which TPL does support. It's a bit of a workaround in its current, and it's not really the way it's intended to be used. But in cases where it's really privacy conscious, where you can't have data that lives on the blockchain, or where you want to hold that back until the last possible moment so you don't accidentally set it without going ahead with it, that's still available. But basically, you have the ability to set fees when an attribute is assigned. There's also different additional modifiers on attribute types. One would be a restricted attribute type. This is for blacklists, where normally, if you have an attribute on your account, you can remove that attribute. Not the case for restricted attributes. Setting one that's only personal. This would be if it needs to be a self-certification for, say, you're self-certifying that you are an accredited investor, right? Then, which is the standard for a lot of investments. Then you could set this type, and in that case, you can't have an operator, a third party, setting the attribute on your behalf. Then this is the set secondary source. This is the one I was talking about that enables you to talk to other jurisdictions and delegate authority in a graceful way and change that as your needs and requirements change. Then the jurisdiction themselves can set a minimum stake in case they themselves have to revoke attributes. The jurisdiction always has the authority to remove attributes, although jurisdictions do not set attributes themselves. They delegate that responsibility to validators. But since they're ultimately the ones that are accountable for the validity of the data, and it's likely that larger projects that utilize them will have old world off-chain contracts and agreements with whoever's managing jurisdictions. So they'll want to be sure that it's by the book. So they can require a fee in order to set an attribute on their jurisdiction. They can require a stake so that they can get paid back for revoking attributes. Then these are the additional methods for adding and removing attributes for basically passing in signatures, and a bunch of methods around how to manage signatures, or even invalidate signatures before they've been submitted. So that's yeah.
So earlier today we had some topics around standardization, some ERC protocols. Is this in line with any of those, or is this your design?
Yeah. So I think that the degree of adherence with various ERCs is a really important and topical point with TPL in particular. And we've tried to make design decisions that would make it pretty simple to not only swap in and out to meet other requirements, but also to wrap jurisdiction in additional interfaces. For instance, if you wanted to have a claims registry as per ERC 780 or 735, you can basically make those same methods available. But if you compare the attribute registry, we're actually just finishing a draft of the attribute registry, and if anyone's interested in taking a look, I'd be happy to share that. But it's a much simpler, smaller specification that doesn't prescribe any methodology for how the attributes are managed or set, which most identity solutions in the current EIP landscape, they're basically a system for how you're going to manage the attributes as well as how you're going to read them. And so in terms of the identity side of things, we've definitely weighed a lot of the options, and the guiding principle is what is going to make this efficient and easy to reason about and broadly compatible. So, and with the token use case in mind in particular, that you don't want a lot of overhead every time, and you don't want the token itself to have to track all the various issuers and assign because that leads to centralization, because you just pick one or two preferred sources of information and rely on those, and you're going to discount everyone else. So this way you can trust the entity that's running the jurisdiction, but they're then going to spread out and trust a whole bunch of various sources. There is support for 165 for checking for registry support. There's in terms of most of the design decisions have been based on sort of best practice in the Zeppelin libraries around, say, off-chain signature approvals and that kind of thing. But I would love to have an active discussion about which EIPs should be considered for inclusion or should be implemented as wrappers. I would love to include more wrapped jurisdictions and registries in the examples for people to make widely available, and in the interest of cross-compatibility, right? Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm looking forward to watching the activity on these smart contracts, and hopefully you guys play around with them, and there it is. Hopefully you play around with them, and if you'd like to be a validator on any of attributes or anything like that, then please let me know. And also, I'm sure we're going to be sharing a lot of information this week in our Telegram discussion group. And if any of you are there already, then it's nice to finally meet you. And if not, then I encourage you to join. Thank you very much.